Can a man with only $4,000 in his pocket change an entire car showroom with nothing but his silence? And what will happen when the true owner of this place finally steps forward? Ethan Cole took a deep breath as the showroom's glass doors slid open, the cool blast of air conditioning washing over his sun-weathered face. His slow, measured steps echoed faintly against the polished tile floor that gleamed under bright ceiling lights, his worn-out shoes creaking softly, out of place in the pristine luxury of the room. Beside him, 14-year-old Lucas walked nervously, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of an oversized jacket, as if trying to disappear from the curious stares directed at the two of them. Ethan gripped the crumpled envelope in his hand tighter, the envelope that held all his savings from 11 years of working as a pipe fitter, $4,000 barely enough to nurture the fragile hope that today he might be able to buy a used truck. A truck that would let him drive his son to school every day, sparing the boy the exhausting bus rides that often made him late. Lucas looked up at the rows of shiny cars, the showroom lights glinting off their metallic paint like jewels, but instead of excitement, he let out a quiet sigh. He knew that the money his father had scraped together couldn't buy anything in this place. Ethan kept walking, his shoulders slightly hunched, trying to maintain his composure as they approached the reception desk. But the contrast between him and the sharply dressed customers around them, polished shoes, designer watches, made him feel like an intruder in another world. Derek Maddox, a man in a tailored gray suit, stepped toward him from the other side of the showroom. His hair was slicked back with precision, his polished shoes reflecting the overhead lights, but it was his cold, cutting eyes that made people hesitate. His gaze flicked over Ethan in a single second, lingering briefly on the crumpled envelope, then dropping to the worn shoes as if that alone was enough to judge his worth. Derek smiled, but it was a smile as sharp and hollow as a blade, the kind of smile someone gives when mocking a cheap joke. His voice carried deliberately loud enough for the other customers to hear. "We don't sell trucks to anyone with less than $5,000 cash. It's policy. Please don't waste our time." The air in the showroom seemed to freeze after his words. The typing of a nearby receptionist stopped, and several curious glances turned toward the father and son. Lucas lowered his head quickly, his face flushing red as his thin shoulders trembled, shame crawling over him like a shadow. He pulled his hood lower to hide his face, but nothing could stop the humiliation from seeping into his small frame. Ethan said nothing, not a word of protest. He only tightened his grip on the envelope until his knuckles turned white. He had spent his entire life swallowing his pride to survive, but in this moment his silence spoke louder than any argument could. Across the showroom, among the gleaming cars, a man in a faded baseball cap stood watching. Grant Mitchell, the true owner of the dealership, did not step forward, not yet, but his gaze was sharp, fixed on Derek's every movement and on Ethan's bowed head. This wasn't the first time Grant had seen something like this men like Derek, who treated selling cars as a way to measure a person's worth by the money they carried. But what held Grant's attention was the boy standing behind his father, trying to make himself as small as possible, just like Ryan Grant's son, who had died in an accident 4 years ago, once did, when classmates mocked him for wearing torn shoes at his first school birthday party. Grant drew in a long breath, his eyes locked on Derek. He didn't rush forward or reveal who he was, but inside, an old fire had been rekindled, smoldering, ready to ignite at any moment. The bright showroom hummed with quiet chatter again, but in that moment, everything else faded, leaving only a heavy, suffocating silence where one father stood powerless under scorn, and another man weighed whether he would let this injustice go on for even one more second. Grant Mitchell walked slowly between the rows of gleaming cars, each polished to perfection until the paint reflected like mirrors under the sophisticated ceiling lights. But he paid no attention to them, not today. His hand rested on the cold surface of a midnight blue pickup truck, the chill biting into the calloused skin of his palm, a harsh reminder he didn't need. His eyes didn't linger on the truck. They looked straight through it, past this moment, to a place where Ryan's smile still existed. In his memory, his curly-haired boy sat in the passenger seat, small legs propped up on the dashboard, face glowing with joy as he clutched a bag of potato chips. "Let's go, Dad!" Ryan's voice rang clear in his mind, bright and cheerful, as if the boy were still there, waiting for another long drive meant just for the two of them. The image cut into Grant's heart like a dull blade, slow and agonizing, especially as the next memory always followed the old truck crushed and twisted under the flicker of ambulance lights, sirens wailing through the rainy night, and a blanket pulled over Ryan's still face. Grant's fist tightened, knuckles turning white, and he drew in a sharp breath as if trying to swallow the storm building in his chest. Derek Maddox's mocking laugh sliced through the haze of memories, sharp and grating, not caring who could hear. $4,000? What do you think this is, a used car lot? This is a showroom, not a charity. Grant's head turned slowly, his eyes landing on Ethan Cole standing by the counter, his shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. Lucas, the boy beside him, stared down at the shiny tiled floor, his small hands clenched tightly inside his jacket pockets, his thin shoulders trembling. That sight hit Grant like an arrow. For one fleeting second, that boy was Ryan, the same hunched stance, the same helpless eyes trying to hide from the world. And worse, the boy was learning a bitter lesson, that to men like Derek, a person's worth was measured only by the money in their hands. Grant took a deep, steadying breath, forcing control over himself. He couldn't let emotions take over, not yet. His hand stayed on the cold metal of the midnight truck, but his breathing changed slower, heavier, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. No one noticed the man in the worn baseball cap standing quietly in the glittering showroom, but if anyone had looked into his eyes at that moment, they would have seen something flicker to life beneath the calm facade, something deeply human, but dangerous all the same. Old pain on the verge of becoming action. Grant turned away, walking slowly toward the next row of cars, but his eyes were no longer on the vehicles. They were locked on Derek's back, sharp and unblinking, like a predator watching its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And in Grant's mind, only one question repeated over and over, not what he would do, but when. Ethan Cole walked back into the showroom after a few minutes outside, taking slow, heavy breaths as if each step carried the weight of his dignity. His eyes, though tired, still held a faint glimmer of hope, fragile but persistent. He spotted Jake Rourke, the young salesman with a kind face, a warm voice, and hands that always moved with polite precision. "The gray F-150 out in the lot, is it still available?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly, like a man afraid the answer might crush the last hope he had left. Jake nodded, his eyes brightening just a little, perhaps sensing that Ethan needed this truck more than anyone else who had walked in today. "It's still there, and it's a solid truck. I can help you go through the paperwork." But before he could finish, Derek Maddox swept in like a cold gust of wind. His familiar half-smile curled across his sharp features, and his voice cut through the air with deliberate harshness. "What are you doing back here? I thought I made it clear. We don't waste time approving cases like yours." Ethan lowered his head but tried to keep his voice calm. "I've managed to save almost $4,000. I don't need a new truck, just something reliable enough to get my son to school." His words faded at the end, more like a plea than a negotiation. Derek laughed, the sound dry and hollow, echoing through the showroom like a cruel reminder of power. His eyes darted to Lucas, sharp and cold, as if engraving this humiliation into the boy's memory. $4,000? What do you think this is? A junkyard auction? That money wouldn't even cover the floor mats for one of these trucks. He emphasized each word, deliberately loud enough for the surrounding customers to hear. A few turned to look, some with curiosity, others with indifference. But for Lucas, every glance felt like a blade. Lucas bit his lip hard, his small hands trembling inside his jacket pockets, not from the chill but from the anger swelling in his chest. He wanted to shout, to defend his father, but one look at Ethan's sad, resigned expression silenced him. He stared at the shiny tile floor, where his own flushed face stared back at him in reflection, burning with shame. From across the room, Grant Mitchell watched it all unfold. Every word that came out of Derek's mouth was like acid dripping onto an old scar in Grant's heart. He didn't move toward them, not yet, but his eyes darkened, his jaw tightened, and the muscles in his arms flexed, coiled tight as if preparing for impact. And Jake, standing beside Derek, looked just as disturbed, his lips pressed into a thin line. But fear held him back, keeping him silent. The air in the showroom shifted, subtle but unmistakable, heavy with something unspoken. It felt like the drawn tension of a bowstring pulled to its breaking point, waiting for the single command that would let it snap. The sound of tearing paper cut through the air like a cold blade slicing the room in half. Derek Maddox yanked the folder from Jake's hands, the crisp white pages ripping apart into tiny fragments, fluttering to the polished showroom floor like shreds of dignity being trampled underfoot. He didn't even glance at Ethan, just jerked his chin toward the trash can, his voice loud and sharp, echoing like a verdict already decided. "Go buy hope somewhere else, Mr. Cole. We sell real trucks here, not dreams." His words reverberated through the space, drawing the curious stares of a few customers, their eyes a mix of intrigue and indifference, but no one spoke. Ethan crouched down, his hands trembling as he picked up the torn pieces of paper, moving slowly as if trying to piece back together something more valuable than the paperwork itself, the pride that had just been shredded in front of everyone. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He simply gathered the scraps with quiet determination, his broad shoulders quivering slightly, his figure under the bright showroom lights looking small and heartbreakingly out of place. Lucas stood beside him, his eyes glistening, his small hand gripping tightly to the hem of his father's coat. He didn't dare say much, only whispered, his voice soft and pleading, barely audible in the vast, gleaming room. "Dad, let's go." Ethan heard him. He looked at his son, his face etched with quiet self-reproach, and nodded, sliding the torn papers back into the crumpled envelope. He stood, taking Lucas's hand in his own, squeezing it tightly as if afraid to let go, as if letting go meant losing far more than just a deal. The showroom grew strangely quiet. The murmur of other customers faded, leaving only the heavy sound of 2 pairs of footsteps moving toward the door, each step sinking like a weight into the polished tile, marking a trail of quiet humiliation and resignation. But not everyone stayed silent. From a corner of the room, Grant Mitchell's eyes locked onto Derek. His stare was unblinking, cold, and deep like an abyss. His hand slowly curled into a fist, the tendons standing out beneath his sun-browned skin, his knuckles whitening as if he were restraining something primal, something dangerous. He had seen injustice before, but this Lucas's bowed head, the boy's trembling shoulders, it was too perfect a mirror of the painful memory that haunted him. Jake Rourke stood frozen, his face tight with conflict. His gaze flicked toward Derek, filled with clear disapproval, his lips pressed into a thin line as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he stayed silent, rooted to his spot. No one dared to speak. Derek held the authority here, at least for now. Ethan and Lucas reached the door, neither of them looking back. Lucas turned his face slightly away, trying to hide the tear rolling down his cheek, while Ethan kept his face remarkably composed, though his eyes looked clouded, like water hiding the turbulence beneath. Grant still hadn't moved, but in that silence, a decision had already been made. The moment his hand loosened for just a breath, then clenched again, it was like an invisible signal, the quiet before a storm. Not a storm of nature, but of justice, the kind of justice people like Derek had long forgotten existed. Ethan Cole walked slowly toward the door, each step weighed down as if he were dragging a lifetime of quiet endurance behind him. His hand gripped Lucas's tightly, passing to the boy what little strength he had left. But in the depths of Ethan's tired eyes, the faint glimmer of hope had nearly extinguished. Grant Mitchell stood not far away, his gaze fixed on every movement of the father and son, and in that moment, he knew he could no longer stand still. He moved toward Jake, his voice low but firm as steel, each word deliberate, just loud enough for Jake to hear. The gray F-150 out back, it's still there, isn't it? Jake blinked, caught off guard by the intensity in Grant's stare, a stare so deep and sharp it silenced any questions. Yes, it's still there, Jake replied, his voice slightly unsteady. Grant gave a single, measured nod, his eyes never leaving Ethan's back as he walked toward the door. I think that truck belongs to them. Ethan froze mid-step when the voice broke through the silence behind him, a voice he didn't recognize, but one that carried authority, more a command than a suggestion. He turned, his eyes filled with confusion. I don't have enough money, Ethan said, his voice rough, weighed down by tension and shame. Grant approached, not quickly, but each step steady, his gaze softening as it fell on Lucas. Sometimes, he said calmly, it's the truck that finds the right person, not the other way around. Lucas's eyes widened, and for the first time that afternoon they sparkled with something bright, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Dad, can we at least look at it? His voice was small but full of hope as he tugged gently at Ethan's hand. Ethan looked at his son, his own eyes torn between harsh reality and the fragile spark of belief shining in the boy's face. Finally, he nodded, slowly, almost helplessly, but there was a quiet determination in the motion. Grant turned, gesturing to Jake, and the three of them began walking toward the door leading to the lot out back. The showroom stayed wrapped in a tense silence, but if anyone was paying attention, they would notice the subtle shift in the air, the way glances now darted toward Grant, cautious and curious. Something had changed, something unspoken but undeniable. The real authority in the room had just shifted hands. The gray F-150 sat at the far end of the lot, its surface coated with a thin layer of dust that shimmered faintly in the soft evening light. It didn't stand out among the rows of shiny new trucks, but there was a quiet strength to it, the kind carried by something that had weathered many storms and still stood firm. Ethan stood in front of it, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to touch the cold metal of the door. His rough fingers traced the small scratches, the subtle curves of the body, as if waking a memory long buried. "It's just like the one I used to have," he murmured, his voice catching in his throat. "Same gray color, same shape, only that one gave out for good after its engine's final struggle." Lucas stood beside his father, his wide eyes shining with something that hadn't been there in months, genuine excitement. He carefully opened the driver's side door and climbed in, his small hand resting on the steering wheel as if he were touching a treasure. The worn leather seat creaked softly as he shifted, but he didn't care. Instead, Lucas smiled, a pure and simple smile, the kind of joy only a child can feel when a dream begins to feel real. Ethan watched his son, his lips parting as if to say something, but closing again. In his eyes, emotions collided: relief, gratitude, and the lingering ache of regret. He had promised Lucas so many times that someday they would have a decent vehicle, but he had never dared to imagine that day might come so soon. A few steps away, Grant Mitchell stood silently, his face calm, but his eyes betraying a rare softness. Pulling out his phone, his voice was firm and unyielding, every word sharp with authority. "Complete all paperwork for the gray F-150. Title it under Ethan Cole. No fees, no installments, no conditions. Hand him the keys when it's done." The line on the other end was silent for a moment before a respectful voice responded, "Yes, Mr. Mitchell." Grant ended the call, his gaze lingering on Lucas, who was now gripping the wheel, his face glowing with happiness so bright it sent an unexpected ache through Grant's chest, a feeling he thought he had buried with Ryan long ago. Jake came running, slightly out of breath from rushing the paperwork. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice unsteady, his eyes wide with emotion. "Ethan, he's crying." Grant turned to look at Ethan. Yes, he was, but these weren't the tears of a broken man. Ethan leaned against the truck's door, his large hands covering part of his face, his shoulders trembling slightly. For the first time in years, he cried not out of despair or defeat, but for something too overwhelming to express unexpected kindness. Jake's voice softened, breaking with feeling. He said he's never owned a truck with all its windows still intact. Grant remained silent, but his eyes lowered, shadows of old pain flickering in them. He turned his face slightly away so no one could see his expression, but his hand, hidden in his coat pocket, tightened unconsciously. This wasn't just a generous gesture for a stranger. This was a gift, a quiet attempt to make amends for mistakes he could never undo. Lucas turned from the driver's seat, his eyes glistening with hope. "Dad," he asked softly, "is it really ours?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, resting a warm hand on his son's shoulder. His eyes still blurred with tears, but his smile slow and genuine. For them, this wasn't just a truck. This was a new beginning, a promise that no matter how cold the world could be, there were still people willing to give without expecting anything in return. Grant stood silently a few steps away, his eyes fixed on the father and son. Deep inside, something stirred quiet, unspoken, but powerful enough that even he had to admit it. Today wasn't just changing the lives of Ethan and Lucas, it was changing him too. Derek Maddox strode quickly across the lot, the sharp sound of his shoes striking the concrete echoing like a drumbeat signaling an oncoming storm. His face was tight with anger, his brows drawn together, lips pressed into a hard line. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. The gray F-150, the very truck he had mocked and dismissed as something a poor man like Ethan Cole didn't deserve, was now being prepared for that very man. Stopping in front of them, Derek crossed his arms, his voice cutting through the air, loud enough for every employee and curious customer to hear. "This isn't a charity. Who gave permission for him to take that truck without paying full price?" Ethan Cole flinched slightly at the sharp tone, his eyes dropping to the ground, his hands clutching the worn envelope like it was the only shield he had left. Lucas stood just behind his father, his anxious eyes wide, the smile that had just bloomed on his face vanishing as quickly as it came. Grant Mitchell stood tall, turning to face Derek. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed the old baseball cap from his head, every motion purposeful, stretching each second into something heavy and unmissable. The fading evening light caught in his silver-streaked hair and revealed a face familiar to almost every employee, a face they had only ever seen on company posters. A sharp gasp escaped Jake Rourke, his eyes widening as recognition hit him. "Oh my God, that's Grant Mitchell." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and instantly the entire lot fell into a stunned silence. Derek froze, his face draining of color as realization struck like a blow. His eyes widened and his voice stuttered, fumbling for control. Mr. Mitchell, I didn't know you were..." Grant cut him off, his voice deep and sharp, each word falling with the weight of a hammer. "You turned your back on a father not because he was dishonest, not because he did anything wrong, but because he didn't have $5,000 in his hand. Here," he emphasized, his eyes boring into Derek's with the force of a blade, "we don't just sell trucks. We sell trust, and you just trampled it." Derek swallowed hard, scrambling for an excuse, his voice shaking. I was just following policy. I was only..." Grant didn't let him finish. Taking a single measured step forward, his voice stayed calm but carried the force of thunder, commanding the attention of every soul present. "Good. Then today, you will do one final thing by the book. Clean out your desk." His words rang out steady and undeniable, not shouted but heavy enough to feel like a verdict handed down in a courtroom. Jake stood beside them, his expression a mix of shock and quiet satisfaction. Several employees watching from a distance remained silent, but their eyes shifted, filled with agreement, even relief, as if justice, long absent, had finally returned to a place that had forgotten it. Derek opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, but quickly closed it again. There was no escape left for him. His face burned red with humiliation, his gaze darting away from the stares around him. He turned sharply and walked away, his stiff steps and tense shoulders carrying the weight of a man leaving a courtroom in disgrace. Ethan stood still, witnessing it all. He didn't fully understand the deeper implications of what had just happened, but the respect in his eyes for Grant needed no words. Lucas, on the other hand, stared at Grant with unhidden awe, like a boy seeing a real hero step out of a storybook and into real life. Grant stayed where he was, silent now. The sharp coldness in his gaze softened slightly, replaced by steady resolve, an unspoken promise echoing through the lot. This place, these people, would never forget what happened here today. The gray F-150 rolled slowly out of the lot, a thin layer of dust on its body catching the fading sunlight, painting the road ahead in a golden hue. Ethan Cole sat behind the wheel, his hands gripping it tightly, not out of fear, but because of the overwhelming wave of emotion surging in his chest. His eyes shimmered, and when he glanced at his son sitting beside him, a rare, genuine smile tugged at the corner of his lips, a smile full of quiet happiness. Lucas sat in the passenger seat, his small hands clutching the auxiliary steering wheel, his legs swinging with excitement. He tilted his head up, his face glowing like the last light of day. "Dad, we really have a truck now." "Really?" Ethan nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. He simply turned to his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his eyes soft as if to say, "Yes, from now on, we have a new beginning." Farther away, Grant Mitchell stood leaning against the showroom's glass doorway, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his gaze following the truck as it drove away. He didn't smile, but there was a quiet peace in his expression, something serene that hadn't been there for years. When the truck disappeared around the bend, Grant lowered his eyes, his shoulders loosening as if he had just set down an invisible weight he had carried for far too long. Jake Rourke stepped up beside him, looking at Grant with a newfound respect. His voice was soft, almost like a reverent whisper. "Today you didn't just sell a truck, Mr. Mitchell, you gave them something much bigger." Grant glanced at Jake, his calm gaze steady, his deep voice warm as he replied, "We don't just sell trucks, Jake. We give back hope. And hope is what makes this place worth existing." The atmosphere in the showroom seemed different now, lighter, warmer. The employees standing around looked toward Grant, their eyes no longer showing respect for just a wealthy boss, but trust in a true leader. Somewhere out there, on the road ahead, the gray F-150 kept rolling, carrying Ethan and Lucas toward a new chapter in their lives. And here, under the bright white lights of the luxurious showroom, Grant Mitchell had just found something he thought he had lost with Ryan's smile, the real reason he had started all of this in the first place. Sometimes, a truck is not just metal and wheels, but trust and hope, given at the right moment. One kind decision can change not only a person's life, but also redefine the true value of an entire business. If you believe that kindness can create great things, hit like and subscribe to help us share more inspiring stories. And don't forget to leave a comment with the words, "Give hope," because sometimes just one small action can be enough to change someone's entire world.